Well, I appreciate all of you coming out on a fairly miserable night to hear a talk about underwater activities. We live on a very dynamic planet. There's no question about it. And in fact, the very fact that it's as dynamic as it is may be responsible for the fact that there is something alive on it. That's an interesting concept to ponder a bit. And as the first step in the talk, what I'd like to do is start by showing you a slide like this, and I'll return to a slide like this throughout the talk to keep track of what I've talked about. The first two topics I'll address will be volcanic microbial biosphere and seafloor hydrothermal systems. And so I'll move through those relatively quickly here. The first point I want to make is that we're in the midst of a great discovery. We're in the process of discovering that the interior of our planet is actually alive, that in fact, by that I mean the rocks themselves, of course, are just rocks, but in the pores and the cracks of the rocks, as far down as we know that what fluid circulates, there's relatively clear evidence now that there are microbes that live in those pores and the cracks. And we don't have any idea how much how large this microbial community might be, but we do know that it's relatively widespread, and I'll share some of that evidence with you. So this is a relatively interesting point, and it's also interesting, I think, that these microbes live on gases that come out of volcanoes. Let me just back up a little bit here and give you a sense. You're all familiar with the Pacific Basin, and I want to just sort of give you the idea that the boundary of a continent is a very fascinating place. But the boundary of the continent is not always the most active portion of the continent. There are portions of the continents on the east coast where the boundary of the continent is in the middle of a plate. All of you have heard of plate tectonics, and I want to just point out, if this is the picture of the ocean underneath the water, this is a picture of the plates. So the planet itself is broken up into a small number of plates, and those plates are dynamically interacting continuously. There are some places where they're pulling apart at about the speed that your fingernails grow. There are other places where they're in fact being jammed together at roughly the same rate. In the cases of where they're being jammed together, one often loses the battle and is thrust beneath the other one, and we call that subduction. That takes place just off of our coast here. It takes place off the coast of South America here. It takes place in this region, but you'll notice the entire Pacific is a single plate. So by looking at the dynamics of plates, we begin to understand the dynamics of what the interior of our planet does in terms of changing the face of the planet. So plate tectonics is an important point. Here, I've removed the emphasis on the continents, and you begin to focus exclusively or largely on the plates themselves. And the fact the plates themselves don't really know very much about what about the fact that they have a continent embedded in them. And so what I'll talk about here in just a second is this particular area right in here. That's the Pacific Northwest, and most of the focus will be on this area, which is where we do our research. The cross-section through that system involves a spreading center where the ridge crest pulls apart. I mentioned that. Hot, molten lava rises to the surface, flows out on the seafloor, and in fact, what's shown here as a magma chamber is a body of molten rock about 1 kilometer below the seafloor that is 1,200 degrees centigrade, or about 2,200 degrees Fahrenheit, and cold seawater percolates down through the cracks and pores of the rocks, is heated, and then rises back to the surface. And by that tale hangs quite a story. So let us move on a bit. I want to point out that, again, the dynamics here, the plate, here referred to as a lithospheric plate, spreads, again, at centimeters per year, and it plunges beneath the adjacent continent. And it's in this area that melting of this plate produces volcanoes like Mount Rainier, Mount St. Helens. Many of you are familiar with this. I won't dwell on it. Here is the boundary. These are the boundaries of the Juan de Fuca plate. This is in this area here in the location. And Seattle, in fact, Kane 130 is right here. This is the spreading center portion of the ridge. This is a fault, and then this is the subduction zone. These are the different plates. The Pacific plate I showed you earlier is huge. The Juan de Fuca plate is relatively small, but fairly complete because we are generating seafloor here, going in both directions, and consuming seafloor here. So we have off of our coast, very fortunately, an entire plate. That plate, at least along the spreading center, the ridge crest, called the Juan de Fuca Ridge, is quite active. The green spots here are areas in which there's active hydrothermal fluid flowing out of the seafloor, very hot fluid rising to the surface of the oceanic crust. And the red stars are places where there have been eruptions in the last 10 years that we know about. This is one of the locations where there was an eruption, and it's one of those red stars, and it's really fascinating what happened. On June 26, 1993, a series of earthquakes began right in this area. They were sensed by the SOSUS array, the sound surveillance system operated by the US Navy, and monitored in that case by Chris Fox and his colleagues at the Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory in NOAA down in Newport. And those earthquakes migrated about 50 kilometers to the north here, which is toward the south, or toward the bottom of the picture, and in 2 days arrived at this location. Within 3.5 days, one of our colleagues, Rick Thompson from Canada, was on site with a ship, and he found a gigantic plume of very hot water associated with this system. Within 10 days, Bob Embley, one of Fox's colleagues, was on site and found a fresh lava flow on the seafloor. Very, very exciting for us, and it was already colonized by microbes. Within 3 months, we were there with Alvin, the deep diving submersible, and this is the kind of thing that we found on the seafloor. We found massive effusions of microbial material, not all microbes, but microbial products, coming out of the seafloor continuously, and it lasted for many, many months, in this case about 15 months. What was most fascinating about this material is that the microbes that were coming out of the seafloor, at least some of them, were unable to multiply at temperatures lower than about 60 or 70 degrees centigrade. In fact, they optimally multiplied at about 90 degrees, and some multiplied up to 115 degrees. Because of the pressure, they were able to have this kind of a life cycle or lifestyle. This was pretty fascinating to us because the temperatures that they were emerging from the seafloor in were only about 15 to 18 degrees centigrade. This implied to us that they must be coming from a greater depth, and much of this work was done by John Paros, my colleague in oceanography, and his students who study the microbiology of these systems. His student, Jim Holden, published an article on these microbes, and they are known as Archaea. They are hyperthermophilic, that is, they love hot water or high temperatures, and this is iron ringing this structure. So the product of its metabolism, what it, in a sense, quote, eats, is iron oxide. In this case, this one actually consumes methane. And these are both Archaea, and this particular one here is a protist. It has a nucleus in it. You can see that here. Well, what I'd like to do is show you activity along the Juan de Fuca Ridge here. I'll come back to this point about the microbes, and let me just say this, that in 8 out of 8 cases since 1993, when we've been to the seafloor, we have found the same thing. Different places that are erupting on the seafloor, when we get there, shortly after the eruptions, massive effusion of microbial material in every single case. We conclude that there is a significant microbial biosphere living below the seafloor associated with volcanoes. Maybe it's beyond volcanoes, but to date we haven't studied those. All right, I'm going to go right into this area here, and we'll come in close. This is a ridge crest. This is an elongate volcano. The red portions are high. The yellow is the valley in between, so there's kind of a little valley. It's about 1 kilometer wide. See the 2-kilometer scale here. And these 4 names refer to hydrothermal vent fields. Now, hydrothermal vent fields are about the size of 2 or 3 football fields each, and they're spaced approximately 2 kilometers apart. And out of each one of these hydrothermal vent fields is jetting very, very hot hydrothermal fluid. Between the vent fields, there's much less intense activity. Just to give you a diagrammatic interpretation of what I have just said, the next slide shows the high-rise zone, which is one of those vent fields. See, there's high-rise, and here's main. We'll show those two. That's what this next slide shows. That's the upflow zone coming from below the seafloor. This is the seafloor up here, right at that level. This is a couple kilometers below. We have good reason to believe that the fluids come from well below the seafloor. And they rise to the surface at about 330 degrees to 350 degrees centigrade. This is the axial valley wall. Remember I showed you the valley between the two orange highs. It was an axial valley. It's about 200 or 300 meters deep. And this is the axial valley floor. And when I take you on a short video trip here in a minute, you'll see what this looks like. In between, there are tube worms, little clumps of tube worms that exist. But over in these two sites, about 2 kilometers apart, are areas where large sulfide structures, like the one on your left, are forming. This is an example of one of those sulfide structures. It's active, and it has tube worms clustering around it. And the tube worms have these reddish plumes, which have hemoglobin, basically, in it to basically help them cycle oxygen down into their interior. Their interior, they have no mouth, no gut, no anus. Their interior is made essentially of what's called a trophosome, and it's a cavity within which they basically farm microbes. They have microbes, they cycle the hydrothermal fluid, dilute hydrothermal fluid down in there. The microbes can extract a living, and they basically, when the tube worm gets hungry, it simply absorbs some of the wall of its trophosome into its body, and they have a symbiotic relationship. Not that different from farmers and cattle. Well, a little different. To give you a sense of the scale of these things, the first thing I'd like to do is ask Alexander Stubbs to join me over here at this structure. The whole purpose of having this, Alexander, put your fist right here. The fist of the size of one of these crabs here is real scale, and they're sort of somewhere between my fist and Alexander's fist. This is real scale. We've got this here for the specific purpose of getting across to you what the size of some of these. This is a little one. This is a small sulfide structure colonized by tube worms. These crabs on the side are basically scavengers. Alexander, thank you very much. I appreciate it. The point of trying to convey to you in some effective way what the scale is a difficult one. This is the pilot, Dudley Foster, on the right, and we made a doll out of Dudley, put it on the sea floor, and it was sort of effective, but there were a lot of comments about which of them was down there. The second thing we did was to try to give you a sense in this fashion. This is Alvin, and those are two normal people, well, fairly normal. They're normal sized anyway. And Alvin is up against something that the grad students in our group have called Godzilla. You can see actually that if those people were about half the height of Alvin, that Godzilla is in fact 14, 15 stories high. This was huge. We thought this must have been there forever, and it must be lasting forever, until in 1996, we went out there and we found that Godzilla had fallen down. So in fact, we're dealing with quite a dynamic environment. And I'd like to discuss with you some of those dynamic processes. The first thing I wanted to talk about, however, is bringing into the picture this idea that the rocks themselves have microbes living inside them. Well, we thought, how can we test this idea? There were a group of us that were able to convince the American Museum of Natural History to provide funds to explore whether life existed inside the rocks. So we went to a place where the flying buttress structure was, the one that's on your left. We went there and we began photographing, taking group photographs. And this mosaic was put together by Mitch Ayland and our group, and it consists of 139 individual electronic images pieced carefully together. And you can actually see that some of the logs have fallen down, in a sense. This particular one is about 24 meters high. That is about 75 feet from about here to here. This one here and this one here are venting 300-degree fluids. So we went there thinking, okay, we'll test this hypothesis. This is the hot water, a blow-up of a cross-section through here, diagrammatically. This is the hot water here, 300 plus. This is the cold water here, 2 degrees centigrade. It's about a meter from there to there. Somewhere in there, we think, is the limit to life in these environments. We have no evidence that life exists and thrives in the very hot water. We have ample evidence that life exists and thrives at 2 degrees centigrade, and we felt that if the microbes could make a living in these systems, somewhere in that boundary would be the limit to life. And in fact, that's what we began to look at. Working with folks from the Applied Physics Lab, Lee Olson and Vern Miller, we were able to put together a strategy that allowed us to lasso, in a sense, one of these structures. In this particular case, it's the one shown right here, which is Rowan. We were using Europa from the Canadian Science Facility, and there was a line here that had about 3,500 meters of very high test line. If you're a fisherman, this was 60,000 pound test line, all right? And once we had the lasso on this thing, we basically took a chainsaw, underwater chainsaw with diamond teeth, and cut through half of it, all right? Then hooked the line to the cage, withdrew the vehicle, and at the surface, acoustically, or using sound, we triggered this flotation set right down here, and it rose to the surface. We picked that up and ran it through the shiv, or the winch that we had on board the ship, on board this particular ship. Now, Debbie Kelly, my colleague, was the chief scientist on this portion of the program, and we were able to raise it to the surface like this. So that's about 4,500 pounds of rock we picked up in a single go. This is Lee Olson here. We were very pleased. John Paros and his colleagues, one of his students, Matt Schrenk, were able to look in the interior and take samples, and what I've shown here are individual cell counts for the points that are in yellow. And every single one of the yellow points had life existing in the rock at a significant level. Microbial life, Archaea, hyperthermophilic microbes. So we were able to establish that within this rock, at least this rock, there were a significant number of microbes that existed, which was very gratifying to us and made us feel that perhaps we were on the right track. What surprised us, we did not expect this, is that you see where the cut surface is labeled there. In 3 days' time, this grew back, this rock, from there to there in 3 days' time. We were very surprised by that. We did not expect that rocks could grow that fast. We still are surprised by it. We're in the process of trying to understand what the dynamics are, and it drives us to want to be there all the time, which is awkward because Alvin has no facilities. So we decided I'm going to take you now to the seafloor and show you some of the video that gives you a sense of the dynamics of these systems. The first thing that you see is a simple, if there can be such a thing, tube worm. And you'll notice it has reflex capability, despite the fact that it has apparently no brain, as well as no mouth, no gut, and no anus. It certainly knows how to protect itself. We'll come back to that point. What you're seeing first here is what the seafloor really looks like. most of the seafloor is a barren, quote, desert, if you will. It's not truly a desert, of course, but it's fairly barren. That was the floor of the valley. We're over near the wall of the valley here. You see the broken rock, which is right at the edge of the cliff. And in just a few seconds, there, the transition, that's the cliff. And you can see the pillow basalts, the basalts that have flowed out, have now been broken by the faulting, which has raised up this wall. We make the transition from there. We're going to approach. When you're getting close to a hydrothermal system, you know it because you begin seeing more life than we saw in those first few pictures. This is a 3 times enhanced fly-through of the approach to this neighborhood. So what you're about to see in the distance will be that particular structure. These others in the foreground are all dead. And we'll go in a little bit closer here in just a second, but that particular structure is the one that you see here. Now, I'm shifting you to a black smoker site. In the lower portion, you see a black smoker. Just behind it, you see a whitish area that is mostly life, microbial life. And on the right-hand side, you see another pillar, as well as another black smoker in the background. As we shift to the right here, just coming onto the screen from your right, is a zone where between those 2 pillars, you can see smoke. We're going to home in there with a high resolution. There we are, close to the structure using a 3-chip color camera there. The fact that the structures seem to be moving around is actually because the camera is on a robot. The robot is on a 2.5 kilometer long line attached to a ship, and it's very rough out there. So the ship is actually moving, and it's actually moving the camera around. What you see in the foreground is a broken piece of rock. Those were crystals of chalcopyrite. Some of them are shown here. That's a close-up. The fluid coming out is 366 degrees centigrade in this particular case. And all the other material that you see there is mostly life. They're called sulfide worms, and they live on the surface of the rock because the rock is like a great diffuser. The hot water inside diffuses slowly through the wall because it's porous, and these sulfide worms and tube worms and all sorts of other creatures, limpets and other things, can make a living on the fluid that migrates outward because the fluid contains volcanic gases in it. Here's a close-up of a field of tube worms, and we'll sort of breeze through these in a way, and what you'll see is the ability of the tube worm to react to stimulus. And the reason they are able to do this is that the crabs that you see over here on the wall often dine on this neighborhood. You'll be able to see, in some cases, the tube worms withdraw. Here, next to that lush bush of tube worms, looks like it's been scorched, and that's exactly what has happened. The hot water overflowed beneath this portion, and it simply turned the neighborhood black. And it's what you're looking at now is a recovery. Many of those tube worms have died, and you're looking at the vestiges of that. Here's one in the foreground in the middle here. As we move along, you see over on the right-hand side a little rounded beetle. Looks like a bug. It is a bug. Here, now watch right here. There, they have the ability to withdraw when they feel they're being threatened. What you're looking at there are the creatures that live on the creatures that live on the creatures. So this is very much like what the seafloor is like. Here we're moving up the surface of a structure just like this one, and you can see the lush growth. Remember the first images that I showed you. There wasn't very much on the seafloor. When the volcanoes are active, this is the kind of life that you see. I want to point out something here. You see the black smoker. We're underneath it now, and you can see a puddle of water. It's almost like this is an upside-down waterfall, in a sense. We didn't know to look for these. We never looked for these until about 1988, when we finally decided to look underneath the black smoker, and we found a puddle of water. That puddle of water is about 300, in that case, 366, just like the other one. The one you're going to see under this flange, this overhang, is 354 degrees. You see the puddle of water up underneath there. It's actually rippling. It's caught because it's buoyant 354 degree fluid. And you're looking, with the camera, you're looking through 2 degrees C fluid. There's very vigorous life existing through these things. Now here's another example of a flange. We're looking up under the flange, and you'll see the puddle actually rippling because the robot is making their waves. Here we have a black smoker that is actually, you can see through the base of it. Now watch the speed change. That it was just a change in the output velocity. What we've done is is increased by a factor of 5 the speed, so you can see this scale worm moving across the surface trying to get away from the heat, presumably. And that instrument that you saw inserted was a sampling device. We actually took a sample while you were watching. We did it at 5 times the normal rate. Here's a gravid spider crab she's carrying eggs. And you'll notice that she grooms herself like any self-respecting crab. That was an attempt to give you a feel for what's on the seafloor. We come to some very primary questions here. And one of the questions is the subsea floor volcanic biosphere important? There are a number of other questions, and the last one here, how can we investigate it? Let me address the first one at the top and say that in 1981, Jack Corliss, John Paros, and Sarah Hoffman published this paper in which they put forth a hypothesis that life may have originated on Earth in these submarine hydrothermal systems. And it was roundly laughed at across the entire community until in the late 80s, early 90s, several people, Jim Casting, Norm Sleep, began publishing papers about the impact bolides that must have been common early on in the evolution of our planet, and that the seafloor was probably the safest place for life to succeed and to survive, because impacting meteorites, bolides or meteorites, coming from outer space, if they were of the scale of 100 kilometers across, could volatilize the upper 2 or 3 kilometers of the ocean. So the safest place on Earth was down in the rocks below the ocean. And in fact, if I can say it loosely, in those days, there were not very many continents. The continents were small, so warm, shallow ponds, which is where Darwin has hypothesized life may have originated, weren't very common, put it that way. So to summarize what we've talked about so far, rocks below the seafloor near active volcanoes harbor an unexplored but potentially vast microbial biosphere that thrives on high temperatures, hyperthermophilic, remember that term, and it lives on the volatiles from the Earth's interior. Well, if it's true on the seafloor, if it's true on this Earth, on this planet, could it be true elsewhere? Well, that's the question that we'll face here next. And the next 2 issues that I'll touch on will be the possibility of another ocean and planetary processes and life support. This is one of the most exquisite pictures I think human beings have obtained in a very, very long time, and we've done an awful lot of really phenomenal picture taking in our cultural history. But this is one that shows the 2 moons of Jupiter side by side. It was taken by Voyager in 1979. The first one is Io, the most volcanically active body in the solar system, and the second one is an ice ball. All right, let's look at both of them. The first one, Io, you can see here on the periphery, right on the limb, a little disturbance, and it's enlarged over here, and what that is an erupting volcano that is ejecting material about 200 kilometers above the surface of the planet. And when Voyager went by in 1979, Voyager 1, it saw about 9 of these phenomena taking place simultaneously. And when Voyager 2 went by months later, 8 of them were still going. Here's another one. You can see the image is shown right here, and it's enlarged here. You see the top of the plume, and then you see the shadow here off to the side. The most volcanically active body in the solar system, and it's driven by tidal forces. This is its nearest neighbor. The surface is water ice. The density is about 3 of the entire body. So the fact that its surface is ice means, and the density is 3, means that it cannot be ice all the way through. In fact, it has to have a rocky interior. The diameter is nearly that of our moon. It's slightly smaller. And the surface temperature is about 100 degrees Kelvin, or very, very cold. It's colder than it is in Minnesota sometimes. The surface, if we get in close, you can see these almost look like freeways running across the surface of the planet. And this particular area here is known as the Connemara chaos. And if we go in a little closer and look at that, you can see it's made up of platelets. And those platelets appear to have drifted compared to one another. And in between where the plates are is what we have interpreted texturally as a slurry of a mixture of ice and some mobile fluid, probably water, because everything that we've sensed from distance is H2O on this system. It's just mostly frozen. And so the interpretation is, we'll come in close. We'll take a point of view from down right in this area, looking in that direction. We'll be looking to the north from down here at the bottom of the screen. And in relief are shown these, what are now interpreted as icebergs. They're floating about 200, 300 meters above the surrounding slurry, broken material here. And if we look at an earthbound analog, it's something like this. It's a tabular iceberg. It's floating in a slurry of mostly frozen surrounding material. It's actually being blown in this direction, so it has a wake where there's less ice. That can't happen on Europa because, in fact, there is no atmosphere on Europa. Or there's very, very thin atmosphere on Europa. So the interpretation is that these float about 1/9 above and about 8/9 below. So the thickness of the ice layer is viewed as being relatively thin, about 3 to 5 kilometers, maybe 4 or 5 kilometers. But if we look at the density and we consider how much rock has to be in the interior of this structure, we can see very easily that the thickness of the water layer, or the density 1 layer, can be only in about 100 kilometers. It could be 75 kilometers, it could be 150 kilometers, but it can't be very different than that. And yet, we see some evidence, and there's a lot more evidence that I can't cite here, to indicate that, in fact, the thickness of the ice is only about 3 to 5 kilometers. So we have a dilemma. The ice itself is relatively thin. The water layer has to be at least 75 kilometers. So there's the potential, in fact, there's a very strong potential, I would say, of there being a water layer, a liquid water layer beneath this planet. And remember, beneath the surface of this planet. Remember, its nearest neighbor, driven by the same tidal forces that Europa is driven by, is the most volcanically active body in the solar system. So this is perhaps the best interpretation that we can come up with right now. The interior looks something like this. It has a water layer. The bottom of that water layer is rocky. The top of that water layer is icy. And there may be as much as 75 to 100 kilometers of fluid there. What keeps it there? Well, volcanism is the best answer. Volcanism of the type on the floor of that, on the sea floor of that planet, of the type that we've been studying on our planet. So it leaves you with the thought, well, if it can happen here, can it happen there? And this is the way scientists piece together the tiny pieces of intuition to try to lean toward a discovery. Is there life on the floor of the ocean in Europa? We don't know. Do we want to find out? Of course we do. And it's probably one of the best examples of another solar body where there might be simple forms of life, possibly driven by volcanic activity at the bottom of the ocean. For those of you that ask such questions, let me just comment that because it's about 1/7 the gravity of Earth, the pressure at the bottom of a 100-kilometer ocean is only about the same as what it would be in the bottom of the Marianas Trough, Marianas Trench, which is 11 kilometers deep. That's on Earth. Well, I mentioned they were freeways. I just wanted to sort of share with this. This was put together by some grad students at Brown, Bob Papalardo and Jim Head. I might add, Jim Head is giving a talk here next week, which I encourage all of you to come to. This is intended to be humorous. This is not intended to be humorous, perhaps. We take thoughts like this and we put them together in hypotheses, and we hope our hypotheses will eventually become a paradigm or a dominating theme. And this is one we hope perhaps might work. The brittle, water-saturated outer shell of volcanically active planets may indeed harbor, perhaps even initiate, diverse life forms, microbial activity. It's possible. It is clear that volcanoes, independent of the sun, on our planet can support life. With the sun and a liquid ocean present, life can go much beyond the microbial stage, and has on this planet. But the first step, the most exciting step in my view, is to find another place in the solar system or beyond where there might be life. and this is an excellent target. Indeed, by designing truly innovative approaches to studying the way volcanoes support life on our planet, we gain tremendous insight about our own planet. At the same time, it's like a double investment. At the same time, we gain a great deal of insight as to how we might look for similar life on other planets. Would you go to the moon of Earth? No, no ocean. Volcanoes have been dead for 3 billion years. You go to a place where there are the elements that we know on our planet can support life. And in fact, this is one of the more important points I want to make during my lecture, and that is this, that for Earth scientists, ocean scientists, and planetary scientists, among the major issues are the extent, the distribution, the abundance, the diversity, and in fact the nutritional requirements of these microbial communities. What basically do they live on? How do they live together? How do they live apart? How do they live in at all? And the bottom is the key part here. The complex mechanisms linking all of these deep biospheres to planetary processes are one of the things that we need to explore now. It's a new insight. We're interested in making discoveries, and we need to figure out ways to optimize the probability that we will discover something new. When you do that, you look for relationships, and you begin to explore those relationships. Not just volcanoes. It could be earthquakes or faults moving. It could be landslides. It could be any number of processes by which the Earth moves, shakes, changes, unfolds, whatever it does. All of those processes may liberate gases of one form or another that microbes can live on. So we have a new view of the planet. The dynamics of the interior of our planet may very well be as effective at supporting microbial activity as the sun is at supporting trees. This is something for us to think about. Back to the plates, the boundaries of all the plates. In fact, if we really wanted to be bold about it, we might say, let's just choose a plate and study a plate. Why can't we do that? Well, we've never done it before. Well, let's consider the possibility that if we wanted to study a subsea floor biosphere, we would have various ways of going about it. We would take rapid response to seafloor events. That's what we did when we discovered the erupting volcano. We rapidly got out there, found the volcano, sampled the bugs coming out of the seafloor. We could directly explore by drilling. That's being done by the group that's the Ocean Drilling Program. We could take samples for detailed analysis. That's what we did when we picked up the rocks. But the true payoff in the timescales of the children that are at this lecture here and listening to this video, the long-term payoff will be to change the way we do science. Instead of going to sea in ships, instead of going to planets in spacecraft and flying by, we figure out ways to use robots and sensors and communications and command control and artificial intelligence so that we can in fact be in these environments. We project ourselves robotically or in some fashion into these environments, and we bring the information back so that we can know what's going on. That is a powerful new approach to planetary sciences. And that's what I'd like to talk about here for the last few minutes of the discussion. A fiber optic telescope to inner space. Why do I call it that? Because one of the aspects that we're trying to show is that the study of our planet and the study of other planets aren't that different, and that we can in fact use a, quote, telescope to look inward as we plan to explore outward for life. We can understand many of the processes that we're liable to encounter, because those processes, the way volcanoes behave, the way faults form, the way gases move through a planet's interior, the way microbes or whatever the life forms on other planets might make a living, it certainly has to have the dynamics of the planetary behavior. So the goal of something we call NEPTUNE, which is Northeast Pacific Time Series Undersea Networked Experiments, you can immediately forget that, there'll be no test. The goal would be to establish at plate scale. Why don't we do a plate? Because we can do a plate. We should try. We establish at plate scale a submarine network of remote, interactive, natural laboratories, literally natural, they're out there, they're changing. We have robots, we have tools, we have sensors, we have cameras, we have high-definition television to look in real time. That is, it comes through the internet to your computer in your home, in your school, in your laboratory. Real-time, four-dimensional experiments designed to quantify the links among oceanographic processes, all of which have not been thoroughly studied in this fashion, and plate tectonic processes. So the plate processes can be looked at, the ocean processes can be looked at, and the fact that the plate evolves under the ocean is another way of looking at the linkages. This could be very exciting. What are the premises underlying an approach like this? Well, one premise might be that there are many, many globally significant processes that operate at plate scale or smaller. So by choosing a plate, we could study all of the processes, many of the processes that operate on the entire planet. The second would be, premise two would be a four-dimensional study, a really thorough four-dimensional study, meaning space, 3D, through time, of one of these plate or mesoscale oceanographic processes or systems would inform us about all of them, all right? So by doing one very well, we gain insights into all of them. And finally, doing something like this requires a long-term commitment. We don't do this for the summer. We don't do this for 5 years. We do this for decades. We do this for the lifetime of your children, at least, because on those timescales, we get new insights that we can get in no other way. We would have to start with a well-defined spatial context. We have to know where it is we're going to go and what the distribution and relationships are. We would want to explore the time domain. So this comes back to the theme that I want to talk about. We are discovery-oriented. We are a curious species. We walk around on our hind legs. You take a 2-year-old, and they see a bug walking along the sidewalk, and they pick it up and they taste it. They're designed to do that because that's an experiment. And they do all sorts of other things you don't want to talk about. But that's what we are. And so we want to explore the time domain because we haven't explored the time domain. We've only looked at the spatial domain. A new way of looking at things gives us new discoveries. The intrinsically interdisciplinary nature of what we're going to try to do in a system like this is clear. When we look at the physics that dominates the chemistry, which results in the microbial and biological phenomena that we see here, we cannot study one aspect or the other. We have to study the entire system. You can, as all scientists who study the natural world know, you can't really separate it out or you will never get to understanding. We need to define feedback mechanisms. I won't go into detail there. A new generation of planetary students and scientists who actually can move across the boundaries of disciplines. We have a new class of theoretical models that can deal with real-time data coming ashore. We would have gigabit type flow of data ashore per second if we choose. One of the most important aspects of an approach like this, however, is that unlike a cruise where you go out to sea, you do your work for 30 days, you bring your data back, and you sit in your laboratory and you publish a paper in a little journal that 12 people read. That's science now. What we really have to do is, in fact, do our science a little more in public and let people look over our shoulders electronically as we make our discoveries, as we make our mistakes, and it could be at least as interesting as watching the Senate debate. Well, where would you like to do this, John? I would like to do it off the coast on the Juan de Fuca plate. This should be no surprise to anyone. This is an example of what the plate geometry looks like. This is what the cable would look like. The white stripes there are cable. The orange nodes are, in fact, experimental sites. And each of the experimental sites might have hundreds of different instruments wired directly to a hub. All of the data on the cable could actually be pumped back or transmitted back to land. And it could be a two-way link. The tectonic scale of the plate, these are the characteristics of Neptune. The tectonic plate scale, as I've just shown you, there'd be a tremendous amount of power. This would liberate the scientists in a great, significant way. We could actually freeze samples on the seafloor. We could have robots that actually are rovers that could drive around on the seafloor. We could have automatic robotic fish that could swim from place to place, taking samples or observing erupting volcanoes. Why should we observe an erupting volcano? We've done it because when the volcano erupts, particularly initially, microbes from deep within the planet are expelled to the surface. Otherwise, we won't see them. So we might be able to sample forms of life we've never seen before, or forms of life we might not see unless we go to another planet. We can explore deep within our planet if we're on site when the planet is dynamic. It's very hard to get to an erupting volcano if you're sitting in your laboratory and get there in time. That's a big problem. Let's see, axial, let me just show you what one of these things would look like. Here, axial is a volcano. There's the caldera. This is the depression in the top of the volcano. It's about 1,500 meters deep. And there's magma down underneath this. This is a figure from Bob Emily and Chris Fox on their NEMO observatory, New Millennium Observatory, but it's driven by satellites, which is nice, but it doesn't give you the bandwidth. It doesn't give you as much information. You couldn't run a video camera there. You couldn't run a robot. You couldn't control things very effectively. What we would like to do is take this same depression, this same volcano, axial, and wire it into the fiber optic network. Here's the main trunk line over here on the side with a loop geometry so that we don't lose in case the lava flow flows right across there, which it did 2 years ago. Axial has erupted 2 or 3 times in the last 10 to 15 years. If we're on site with this kind of system in place, there are any number of ways in which we could study this particular active volcano. These are the earthquakes, the earthquake boundaries, along the boundaries of the Juan de Fuca plate. Let's look in detail at what the earthquakes do on this particular plate because it's surprising. This is called the Gorda plate, and this is work that's been put together by William Wilcock with the help of a number of folks. You can see a cluster of points over here. During this interval from August 29, 91 to August 1, 1992, there were a tremendous number, thousands of earthquakes in the middle of the plate. This is the spreading center over on this side. This is the subduction zone on this side. And in the middle of the plate, there was a tremendous amount of earthquake activity. Then at the end of that period, right in late July, early August, these large earthquakes took place. And for the next 92 to 98, for the next 6 years, there was virtually no activity or very little activity in the middle of that plate. So somehow, changes in one location turned off the activity on a given plate. That's really fascinating. Why is that fascinating? Not just because it's an experiment run at plate scale, but because those aren't just earthquakes. Those are cracks forming in a rock. And as the cracks form in the rock, the fluid from below flows up through the cracks. And the fluid is full of gas. And the gas is a nutrient for the microbes. So what you're looking at is a pattern of this biological system that operates under the seafloor. When we look at earthquakes, we're really looking at the dynamics. We're looking at springtime on the seafloor, if you like. When the rocks crack, the bugs bloom. Another way of looking at this system is there is a locked zone. This is the subduction zone. There's a locked zone. And what we find is that Vancouver Island is rising. If you go down by Sook Inlet and sit there for 10 years, you'll be about 1.5 centimeters higher than you were when you got there, because it's rising. It's rising because we think the plate is stuck. The plate is locked and it isn't coming ashore quite as fast there as it is elsewhere. Those are the ingredients of a major earthquake. The Kobe earthquake cost $50 billion all told. So we need to begin thinking about how do we look at these earthquake processes? How do we detect where there might be deformation? We do it by wiring the entire plate like an astronaut in outer space so we can keep track of its behavior. This is the subduction zone. This is the top of the subduction zone here. This is, you see the sediments are coming into this subduction zone. This is the deformation material that's taking place right at the edge of the continent. So we're looking at the early stages of forming a continent. This is the material coming from the plate. Part of the plate goes below and the rest is plastered onto the edge of the continent. That's what you're looking at here. And when this happens, it squeezes gas out of the sediments. And the gas rises, particularly when there are earthquakes. So when there are great earthquakes, we think a significant amount of gas escapes from this area. That's carbon gas. That's methane. That's CO2. We don't know exactly what happens to that, but it's a greenhouse gas. Perhaps when there are great earthquakes, there are also significant inputs to the atmosphere in terms of carbon gases. We don't know. Look at this particular area. I'm going to show you a close-up of that. This is an area where the gas that's rising, it's called methane, can freeze. It rises to a certain level and it freezes because it's so cold. And when it freezes, it cements the rock. And what we're looking at here is the frozen product. It slowly decays and releases gas. Or if the temperature of the bottom water changes significantly, it rapidly melts and releases gas into the overlying ocean. This is the methane that you can see, the plume coming out of the top here is the methane coming out of this ridge, all right? And the methane comes up these faults and comes out on the seafloor. That methane actually supports clams on the seafloor. This is at about 1,000 meters below sea level. And here's some of the ice. This is a photograph of some of the ice from Erwin Seuss and some of his colleagues in Germany. So this is similar to the hydrothermal vents, except it's frozen gas. And this is something, this gas, this methane hydrate, it's called, is actually tremendously abundant. There's about 15 gigatons of this material in the continental margins all around the ocean. Some people think of it as a possible resource. We can burn it. You pick a piece of that up, light it with a match, and it'll burn in your hands. It's a potential resource in terms of energy, but it's also a potential danger in terms of gases that would go into the atmosphere and be a greenhouse type gas. This is the way the circulation of the ocean looks in this area. And the fluids are moving this way at the surface. And in the winter, the Davidson current goes to the north. In the summer, the Davidson current trends to the south. And that controls the phytoplankton blooms and the upwelling processes. We don't know very much about in the overlying ocean. We don't know about much in detail about what goes on because we only have satellite images to look at, like this one. And this shows chlorophyll in the phytoplankton, basically, chlorophyll that's in solution in the fluid. And you can see that there are areas, this particular one associated with the input of the Columbia River, there are areas where there's a lot of productivity in the form of phytoplankton. That's the grass of the open ocean. And there are areas off here where there's a tremendous amount of activity. But we really don't understand this, and all we ever see is the top surface. What we really, with a NEPTUNE type system, we could look at the entire volume and begin to understand the overall process as the Earth evolves. We could use a picket fence of sensors here to look at the migration of fish. This is tremendously interesting to a group of people that study salmon and, for that matter, whales. Through a system of the type that we're talking about, we could actually track the behavior and the migration of whales. We might even be able to understand their feeding habits. Some of these mammals are, in fact, endangered species. We know very little about how to protect them because we can't follow a whale where it goes. And again, the thing that's closest to my heart is the educational potential of a system like NEPTUNE. NEPTUNE would be tremendously powerful, connected to the internet. 5 years from now, there'll be an internet connection in virtually every classroom, in every home. We would be able to allow people to see what's going on in this remote but very dynamic environment. Remember, the rock grew in about 4 days, grew 2 meters. Now, let me just say that when NASA had their robot moving around on the surface of Mars, it was running into rocks, and about 300 million people hit that website in 3 weeks. But those rocks hadn't moved in 3 billion years. On the seafloor, we have rocks that grow 2 meters in 3 days. I think that we have the potential here for engaging the public, I guess I would say. The information from this area, this activity could be put into databases and archives. It could be provided to regional managers to make decisions about what the environment is like. It could be a test bed for studies of what you would send to Europa, what kinds of systems. It could be a place in which you would, in fact, deal with, provide information for the general public. You could cross-correlate what you see with satellites and remote sensing. Scientists and researchers would be able to tap directly into their own experiments. Each one of the experiments, the instruments, would have its own IP address, like your computer. And students of all ages would be able to tap into this system. We imagine a timeline, something like this. We've just completed a conceptual design. The colleagues that have been working most closely with me have been Bruce Howe and Ross Heath here on campus. And we imagine going into a system design phase beginning at about now, and it'll last 3 or 4 years probably. And finally, the procurement will be in 2003 or 4. And finally, installation in this time frame, about 2005, with operations beginning in about 2005 and 6. And we expect it to last about 30 years. Well, what are the benefits of doing something like this? Certainly, new approaches will result in new discoveries, and we are very discovery-oriented. Education, public outreach, that's something I've developed perhaps extensively in this talk, but realize that we haven't even begun to imagine the ways in which we could use a live feed from 21 different locations on the seafloor, all particularly sited to be near an active system. We don't know what we could do in terms of education there. The origin of life, limits to life, would easily be moved forward by studying these systems in their real habitat. We can't really understand a system unless we're involved in it. Ocean productivity, how much productivity takes place as a function of El Nino, as the Pacific decadal oscillation that takes place there, and any number of phenomena and processes. We need to understand the salmon themselves, perhaps even the marine mammals. Understanding the relationship between ocean movement and the life that lives off of the ocean movement and the chemical changes is really crucial. We can't do that very well right now. Understanding plate dynamics, this would be tremendously important. It would give us insights into how volcanoes erupt underwater and when earthquakes take place. Resource formation, hazard mitigation, those are all aspects that could be aided, not solved, but aided by a system like this. Greenhouse gas cycling in the form of the methane hydrates, that would be a very powerful component. And what I haven't mentioned much about is, I want to introduce a new term into your vocabulary, extremophiles. Biological use of, the biotechnological use of some of the enzymes that come out of these microbes could be very, very important. Well, I've been through all these parts, and what I'd like to do is come to the last part and talk to you just a little bit about discovery. This is in fact where we're headed. That is, the solar system and beyond. This is what, as human beings, we are faced with, is to explore our surroundings continuously. And one of the most important statements of this attitude on the part of human beings, I think, comes from the 4 quartets written by T.S. Eliot in 1943, long before we knew anything about activity on the seafloor. And he said in Little Gidding, "We shall not cease from exploration. And the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. Arrive through the unknown, remembered gate, where the last of earth left to discover is that which was the beginning. At the source of the longest river, the voice of a hidden waterfall, not known because not looked for, but heard, half heard, in the stillness beneath the waves of the sea." Thank you very much.